Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Concluded, where I conclude this entire year by ranking some of my top 10 worst and best album covers, songs, and albums that I've heard this year. And right now we're gonna get right into this new category of ranking the albums themselves, and we're starting off with my personal top 10 worst albums that I've heard this entire year. Now yes, there might be some overlap between this list and the list that I made for my top 10 worst songs, but honestly stay tuned because I think there's gonna be a lot different as well. And actually, when making this video or when writing the script for this video, I really couldn't come back and re-listen to these entire albums because I would not endure that, really I wouldn't. So what I did is I rewatched the episodes that I made about these albums and I basically got all of my ideas from there. So yeah, you're gonna see me talking about these albums much like how I addressed them in the original videos, though I must admit that the top albums on this list are ones that I have more grudges about, so I'm gonna be talking more freehand, that is to say. But anyway, let's start off with number 10. So starting us off at number 10, we have Beyond Man and Time by rpwl from the year 2012. So this first pick on this list comes to us from the very popular German progressive rock band rpwl, and personally I really dislike this album by theirs, which is genuinely considered to be their best work, so that tells you a lot about my relationship with their music. And this was only even further exemplified when I went ahead and saw these guys live this summer, and I completely realized that I am not a big fan of what they create. A lot of this band's music, to me at least, emanates a lot of staleness and not being progressive that much, and that makes somewhat of a sense when you start realizing that this band started off as a Pink Floyd cover band, and then at the rest of their career they've basically taken a lot of inspiration from the later era of Pink Floyd, but within that they've only taken inspirations from their most basic, simplest, disinteresting parts of the later Pink Floyd era, and somehow managed to stretch those out into full albums, with this one being what is my least favorite of their discography that I know not a lot of. Now that is to say, I don't think that this band is musically inferior. I've seen them live and I know they're capable of great things, but downright I don't think that this music on this album is good in any way, and it's definitely not really good even in prog terms, if you even can start calling this album as being progressive rock, because in my personal opinion I think that this one maybe qualifies as space rock, and then brings us back to the whole debate of whether space rock is progressive rock, whether Pink Floyd is progressive rock, and so on and so forth. Coming in at number 9, we have A Storm Is Coming by Bjorn Reese from the year 2019. So honestly, if there was one album on this entire series that could have easily made it into the 3 worst categories that I reviewed in this 365 Concluded, it would have been A Storm Is Coming by Bjorn Reese. Not only does it sport such a horrendous cover in my personal opinion, it is also a shit album from start to finish. But whenever you hear something like a Norwegian multi-instrument leaves his progressive rock oriented band to do a solo album, good things conjure up in your head, and that's definitely what I've had before getting to listen to this album. But when I sat down with this one, oh boy, I realized that reality was far off from what I expected. Yes, this album is just really stale, really bad, just ambient music, sorta. I don't really know what it's supposed to be, but let me tell you, this album is so forgettable that I honestly don't have a lot to say on it right here, because I don't remember anything from it besides the fact that it's just so stale, so monotonous, so repetitive, so uninspiring and uninspired that it's just painful. And yes, of course, with an album like this of 51 minutes long, it definitely overstays its welcome by about 51 minutes. And the fact of the matter is, I think that this album was supposed to be somewhat personal, at least to Bjorn Reese himself, but it just royally fails to do so. It is not personal, it doesn't feel anyway personal, it feels like a waste of time by the artist standards and by the listener standards as well. Coming in at number 8, we have Rock Bottom by Robert Wyatt from the year 1974. Yes, This album, my most controversial pick to date. So yes, originally when reviewing this album I gave it a rating of 4 out of 10, knowing downright that this one is considered to be a seminal, if not the best ever Canterbury scene prog album that is out there, yet I never saw any of that. Now originally I argued that the acclaim that this album receives basically has a lot to do with its backstory, you know, the idea that Robert Wyatt went through this accident and has lost his ability to drum and it's so painful, and then he wrote this album, but apparently a lot of you guys have informed me that that is not the reason why you like this album and that you genuinely enjoy its music, which is something that I literally cannot see eye to eye with in any freaking sense. But rest assured, I have taken it upon myself to re-listen to this album since, only to realize that I just simply don't get it. I don't like it, I don't enjoy its music, I feel like this album is trying to be as distasteful as possible, at least as being inapproachable to many people, and I can't quite honestly understand what people find with this one. It is so detached from normal music to some extent, even from normal progressive rock music, that it's honestly just not really something that I feel like you should listen to in order to enjoy. And if so many people rank this album as being the best of the Canterbury scene, but it's also an album that they don't enjoy, then I honestly don't get any of you guys. Honestly, maybe I could have just appreciated this one for its technicality, but still I don't see any of that, and this leaves this album Rock Bottom by Robert Wyatt as being my biggest mystery in progressive rock ever. Why so many people like this album, and why can I not see that myself? Coming in at number 7 we have Space Hymns by Ramses from 1971. So quoting myself from the original video that I made about this album, this is an album made by a man who used to be a central heating salesman and whose wife believed him to be a pharaoh. And with this pretty out there backstory, that's how Ramses created this album. Now you might recall that this album actually won the best album cover category, and while that might be really truthful, the fact of the matter is this album is represented by such a great cover that it's honestly painful to just realize how bad this album is. It has tinges of folk, maybe blues, maybe jazz, and definitely somewhat of a rock tinge to it, and all in all it is encompassed by the loosest shield of progressive rock as well, which technically makes it a worthy listen, at least if you're looking for obscure prog albums. But the fact of the matter is this album is so freaking bad, and I know that it came out in a time when progressive rock was still not yet materialized and well realized, but the fact of the matter is I am so glad that no progressive rock went in the direction of this album, because then we would have been in a much bleaker world. This album is redundant, it is forgettable, it is nothing to write back home about. I don't encourage anyone to go ahead and listen to it, and the fact of the matter is I see that a lot of people would call this one as like the best Ramses album out there, and nothing really surpasses this one. So I have to ask myself the question, if this is his best, then why do people remember him? And well, I think that the only reason for it is the persona really. You know, he thought he was a pharaoh, his wife thought she was the wife of a pharaoh, he dressed up like a pharaoh, and you can even see it in the gatefold of this album, and it's so freaking ridiculous. And who knows, maybe people will just remember this album for its absolute kick-ass cover, and that's definitely why I will remember it. So coming in at number 6 we have Our Time on Earth by Compass from the year 2020. So if you don't know this already, the only reason why this album made it on the list is because it was randomly substituting another Flower Kings album that I really didn't want to listen to, and well, I think that I've learned my lesson there. Substituting that Flower Kings album was probably the worst decision I could have ever made, because this album is just so bad, so time wasting, so uninspiring, so unpromising, and I don't know why anyone would actually listen to this. For some reason, people would consider Compass as being a prog band, and I think that the only reason for why that is because its individual members do have some prog history to their names, so I guess that's why. But the fact of the matter is this album is the furthest thing you can imagine from prog anyway. But the thing also is, this album tries to be progressive to some extent and it just comes off as the worst thing ever. This album has the tinges of like soft metal, maybe neo-prog in it to some extent, and it's honestly so painful to endure. It is so uninspired, it is so uncreative, it is so unoriginal. I don't get why people listen to this type of music. This is everything that I try and stray away from when I come and listen to progressive rock. Yet, this album was still an episode that I did on the list, and let me tell you, this album just leaves so much to be desired. I see no redeemable qualities about it, and I wouldn't really suggest anyone to go ahead and check it out. Coming in at number 5, we have Galactic Zoo Dossier by Kingdom Come from the year 1971. So when I originally reviewed this album in my video, I brought up the proposition that maybe this album was just made not to be enjoyed. But while I have not gone back and listened to this album in its entirety ever since, I kind of find it doubtable whether this was actually the idea of Arthur Brown's Kingdom Come, and I do believe that this album was created genuinely to be enjoyed, but it just really severely lacks in that and just doesn't make for an enjoyable listen at all. I actually do not know why this album stood the test of time. I still sometimes see copies of this album going around and I don't know why that is, why people would even purchase this type of thing. Why do people remember this album and don't remember other things like After All by After All, stuff like that? Because this album truly and utterly deserves to be forgotten. This album literally makes an effort to not be enjoyable. Most of its time it's just really redundant. It's just really, lame. The things on it are just so forgettable, but the fact of the matter is there are certain points on this album which are genuinely enjoyable, and it seems to me like the band are doing their utmost best to give it these sort of tinges of good and take them away as fast as they came, just to, destroy any hopes for something good in this album that you might have had. And yes, pair that with the awful vocals by Arthur Brown on here. On the one hand, this man seems to have a great vocal range and a great ability to control his vocals, but what he does on here is supposed to make my ears melt, and not in a good way. And that is why I believe that this is the first bad album that we're seeing on here. I think that the rest of the albums that came before this one were not that enjoyable and maybe even sufferable, but this one is downright a bad album, as are the next few to come. So coming in at number 4, we have Lazarus Bird by the band Burst from the year 2008. So funnily enough, we have in 4th place the 4th album that I reviewed this year, that being Lazarus Bird by Burst, which also happens to be the first progressive metal album that I've heard this year, and honestly, what a bad way to start off with. I will give it that, Lazarus Bird does have this sort of unique metal that you'd find in most Israeli prog metal bands and even somewhat Norwegian prog bands that take a lot of inspiration from like Middle Eastern and generally Eastern instruments and styles of music, and that's fine, like Reincarnation and stuff, but the fact of the matter is this album utilizes them to such a poor extent. This album is monotonous, it is overwhelming at the same time, it is always so over the top, and it just leaves nothing to be remembered from it. The only thing that I do remember from this album is that one song called Momentum, which literally starts off with like 2.5 minutes of just very quiet song noises, stuff like that, and then it comes crashing down in what I refer to as a jump scare, because literally that is what it did for me. I did not expect this coming crashing down so suddenly, and that is why I remember it, because it was the only thing to contrast the entire magnitude and burstingness of this entire album, which is so unneeded, so redundant, so painful, and as I said, so bad. Coming in at number 3, we have Mouse by the band Aragon from 1995. Honestly, to be truthful with you, I am pretty amazed to see that I put this one in the 3rd spot, because this one was easily my number 1 pick for most of the year. But just sitting down and thinking about this one made me realize that while this is a bad album, there are worse out there that I should probably mention in front of this one. So yes, it only gets the 3rd spot, but do not fool yourselves, this one is a really bad listen. In my top 10 worst songs, I've already basically criticized this entire album for being so bad because it includes the synthesized bass and drums, which sound so inhumane, so impersonal, and just so bad throughout this entire album, seeing as they are utilized to a pretty lengthy extent. But that's not the only bad thing about this album. Firstly, this album consists of 34 songs, and it's not like it's a 3-hour long album. It's a pretty understandably length album. I think at about like an hour and a half or something like that, so most of its songs are less than 2 minutes long, and honestly a lot of them are just transitional and don't really carry any weight to them, and that just adds to this entire album feeling just so segregated, so divided, and it just hinders the entire progression of this entire album. And seeing as this one is a concept album, it's supposed to have somewhat of a progression, of a storyline, of a narrative, which is entirely missed on me on here, because again, the music is bad, the story itself is told very poorly, and the album itself is just made up of so many small bits that it's just painful to listen to. But in addition to that, the fact of the matter is I do get that there is a concept behind this album. There is this idea of, you know, comparing the mouse like Franz Kafka did to the person himself, to the creator himself in this big and wide world, and you know, I really like the concept, and it's just saddening to me to see that this band were not able to put it across and instead to create something that time should forget. Coming in at number 2, we have Magma by the band Gojira from the year 2016. So this album is actually the only album on this list this year that received a rating of 2, so for that reason it is a bit special to me. But yes, much like Mouse by Aragon, the reason this one is so high up on this list is because of the absolutely downright abysmal experience that I've had when listening to this one from front to back. Magma by Gojira is basically just your average extreme metal album, you know, a lot of shredding, a lot of double kick drums and stuff like that all over. They do know how to take the chill pill once in a while, I guess, but still, it doesn't really redeem this album to any extent. But the thing about this album that I really want to point out is the fact that a lot of people would consider this one and the entire discography of Gojira as being a part of progressive metal, basically. And well, I see absolutely none of that in this album, yet I still do take into account the fact that people consider this as being prog, and I rank it as a part of prog, because if you've missed this so far, I've actually not included anything from the album Singularity by the band May, which I reviewed back on episode 37, and that's because I literally didn't have the heart for it, because that album was strictly not progressive rock to any extent, and it just made it on the list by mistake, so I feel bad at even ranking it along these other prog albums. But as it comes down to it, Magma by Gojira is supposed to be prog, and it's the worst execution of it I've probably ever heard. What can I say about this one that I've not said already? It wastes my time, it is redundant, it is painful in my ears, it is just a waste of bandwidth from start to finish, and yeah. That's about it for this album. I never want to come back to it, even if it has a pretty interesting cover to its name, but generally I don't see any reason why anyone would listen to this one, and that is why I'm entirely perplexed as to the amount of fans that Gojira have and what kind of appeal they find in this band. And at the number 1 spot, we have Pictures at an Exhibition by Voyager IV from the year 2019. The one, the only, the worst album I've probably heard in my entire life, and the absolute winner of the 2 worst categories that I have on this 365 concluded miniseries. It is Pictures at an Exhibition by Voyager IV. Yes, 2 days ago when I've taken a look at the worst songs, I've already told you guys why I hate Talk to the Wind and Lucky Man on here so much, because they're abysmal covers of such great songs which were definitely ruined by this band for their will of trying to do things differently for the sake of just doing them differently. But trust me, there are more reasons for why this album is so bad. So firstly, as you might have guessed already, this album definitely has something to do with pictures at an exhibition, and you might be asking yourself, well, is it covering the original Mussorgsky piece? And well, the answer to that is no. It actually aims to cover the cover that EOP did for it, and basically tries to replicate the best live album ever recorded, basically. And well, it fails miserably, because this band has two states when coming down to actually covering pictures at an exhibition. They either do what EOP does note for note, or they either try to do something very different and pretentious and fail miserably at it. And when it comes down to it, I think that this is the worst rendition of pictures at an exhibition that I've ever heard. It sounds so far off from the original, yet it still somewhat sounds like it, so you still have both the originals to compare it to, and it's honestly just abysmal. But it's not the only reason why this album is so bad. You see, in between everything, in between the bad covers and the bad covers for pictures in an exhibition, you also get these original sort of jazzy, maybe somewhat bluesy rock songs as well, and this shows off the creativity that this band simply does not have. Their original pieces are just bad, forgettable, lousy, you know, they're worse than Brian Auger's Oblivion Express at this worst, and yeah, that's a lot to say. This album is just an entire train wreck, and I was hoping that maybe some redemption will be found when I listen to this album live this summer, but let me tell you, I saw these guys live. They were so bad. They recreated this album pretty accurately actually, because they managed to be as bad as it was, if not even worse, to the extent that I actually went up and just went away because I couldn't keep listening to that. And you know, behind me there's this thing over here, and it has signatures from everyone that signed and played at that festival, but the only band that's not signed on here is actually Voyager IV, because I just simply couldn't have their signatures tarnish this beautiful piece. But yeah, this was an overly negative video and yeah, I don't really enjoy doing this that much, but as I said, at the same time, if I want to rank the best, I just have to talk about the worst. You need to know the full picture. You need to know that throughout this entire year, I have went through turmoils of listening to bad stuff and listening to good stuff, although I must conclude and say that most of it was genuinely very good. But yeah, tomorrow we're gonna finish this off when looking at my top 10 best albums that I've seen this year. There's many great picks on there, and it's actually quite different from my top 10 best songs, so you should definitely go ahead and check that video out when it comes out. But as it stands, I'd like to thank my lovely supporters over on Patreon, so thank you so much to Clay Warner, Rest of Kings, and Lindsay Haycox. You guys are just the best, and if any of you want to support me over on Patreon, you can find the link down in the description or in my About page. But that's about it guys, have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you all tomorrow. Bye guys.